All right. Well, as we're inviting in the last few folks from the waiting room on the Zoom, let's go ahead and get started. So my name is Elizabeth Yale, and I am the Vice President for the Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography at Rare Book School. And I'm delighted to welcome you all today to our conversation around new books in critical bibliography, celebrating works that are coming out in the field that we're all kind of excited to read and take a look at. Today's conversation is with Hannah Marcus, who is the author of Forbidden Knowledge, Medicine, Science, and Censorship in Early Modern Italy, and with Nick Wilding, RBS faculty and an associate professor at Georgia State. Did I get that right, Nick? I did, right? Yes. And we're talking today about Hannah's new book, Forbidden Knowledge, Medicine, Science, and Censorship in Early Modern Italy. Hannah is an assistant professor in the Department of History of Science at Harvard University, and her research focuses on scientific culture of early modern Europe between 1400 and 1700, and her book explores the censorship of medical books from their proliferation in print through the prohibitions placed on many of these texts during the Counter-Reformation. So big welcome to Hannah. And Nick, of course, is faculty at RBS and has written two books, Galileo's Idol, Gianfrancesco Sagredo and the Politics of Knowledge, and Faussaire de Lune. And he's with us today interviewing Hannah about her new book. So welcome to you both, and I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you very much, Beth. And thank you to everyone at Rare Book School for organizing this. Hannah, you've written a wonderful book. It's profoundly researched. It asks really important new questions and comes up with convincing answers. So first of all, thank you. And it's the first book I've read from cover to cover in pandemic. So thank you just for getting me to read a book again. I think it would be good maybe to start just by talking a little bit about what the gap on the shelf looked like as you were approaching your dissertation subject and thinking about turning this into a book. If you could just sketch out the scholarship on censorship and how it intersects with the history of medicine, and maybe also tell us a little bit about what had changed in terms of archival access in the years when you entered the scene.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. It's like incredibly touching to see so many familiar names and faces in your little squares, so many friends and mentors here. So thank you so much. Nick, you asked a bunch of questions in that one question, so you'll like redirect me as I need to be redirected. Okay, great. So I have long been interested, and it's so fantastic to have Anne Moyer and Peter Stallybrass here in the history of religion, intellectual history, the history of science, and the history of the book. Hi, Anne. And like since I was an undergraduate, so these like sort of sets of intersecting questions have long been very interesting to me. I even wrote I think I wrote a paper that dealt with this in Peter Stallybrass's class as an undergraduate. So these are questions that I've been sort of noodling on for a long time. And then I went to graduate school, and I'm going to answer this in a few different ways. But one of the things that I think Nick is pointing me to mention to you all is that much of the archival work for this book, we'll call it the first 8 months of archival work and then beyond, took place in the ACDF, the Archive for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, which used to be the Holy Office of the Roman Inquisition and got a name change later on. And that has the archives of the Roman Inquisition and the Index of Prohibited Books. And so, but the reason I'm talking about this, like in relation to graduate school, that opened in 1998, because I was at the 20th anniversary party conference in 2018. So it opened in 1990 to the public, well, not to the public, to researchers in 1998. Some researchers had been allowed in that space for many years previous. But it opened to more scholars in 1998. But then the year that I started graduate school, Ugo Baldini and Lean Spruitt published this like gigantic collection of primary sources, Catholic Church and Modern Science, repeatedly cited in my book as CCMS. And this was just like a really exciting time to be starting graduate school, interested in questions related to science, religion, medicine and book history, because all of a sudden when they opened, when one of the sort of, we've long known that the archives of the Roman Inquisition are not complete, right? So if I'm interested in book history and science and religion, the sort of immediate set of overlapping questions revolves, I think, around censorship. We've long known that the archives for the Congregation of the Inquisition, the Roman Inquisition, are not going to be complete. But when the archive opened, one of the great surprises was that there are really extensive records for the Congregation of the Index of Prohibited Books. So Ugo Baldini and Lane Spruitt had been in the archives digging through some of these and publishing a bunch of these materials. So I had a set of sources that I knew that I could sort of triangulate with a little bit as I started to think about how I wanted to go into the archives and what I wanted to do there. And I actually got emails from both of them this morning, which was really lovely, because I sent copies of my book to them, and both of them said that they arrived today. And I just want to dwell on that for one more second, because I do think that like the archives and the spaces that we're working in shape the kind of work that we do. And I want to point out that like the other people who are there shape that work as well. So I got a seat. There are only 12 seats in the ACDF. It's small. It's like an amazing approach. You come into the Piazza San Pietro, right? The big colonnade, and then you go off to the left, past the guard, the ones in the blue suits, not the multicolored suits. And then you're in the little wing that the archive is in. But then it's like quite a small and unimposing space. It's not like working in the Vatican Library at all. And every day I was coming in and hanging up my coat next to Ugo Baldini, who'd been working in this archive for like 30 years and is this phenomenal scholar of the history of science. He's engaged with materials in the history of medicine as well, history of astrology, incredibly gifted, like textually and philologically. And so every day I was sitting there going through these materials next to the guy who I knew had done so like the most work already in them. And I had this like realization that I was going to have to do something that was a little bit different from what he was doing also, because I wasn't going to be able to like out Ugo Baldini at the kind of work that he was doing. And so I started thinking a little bit about the other kinds of work that I'd done and the kinds of actors that I was interested in. And that led me to thinking about cities outside of Rome and how I might complement the materials that were in the ACDF and the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith archive with materials that were in peripheral archives around Italy. And so after this first sort of like 8 months in Rome, I went on an exciting tour of Italian archives where I visited places from Brindisi and Lecce to Milan and Venice, and many places in between, with like long sojourns in particularly in Bologna, repeated trips to Venice and Padua, a bunch of time in Ravenna. And this was just like, as I was working through materials in the archives, I kept seeing names come up and I kept thinking, well, like, who is this Girolamo Rossi character who keeps writing in as an individual, asking, like sending his own expurgations as an individual person? Like he's writing in saying like, I've got the way to censor these books. I was like, he seems suspicious. Who is he? So I went to Ravenna and I tracked him down. There was a ton of material there. So I was thinking in the archives about what gap I wanted to fill on the shelf. That is, like, I knew I was interested in questions related to censorship. I knew I was interested in questions related to medicine and religion. I'd sort of originally imagined not just doing medicine. So that came out a little bit later, and that came out sort of largely in response to the sources themselves, which is that I was seeing this really intense discourse, and we'll talk more about this later, I'm sure, about utility and about the utility of science. And this was something that I was seeing overwhelmingly in the materials that were about medicine. And as that became increasingly important to how I thought about what was going on in the history of censorship as it related to the history of science, I honed in further and further on some of those medical materials. Maybe I'll stop there and let you redirect me, because I've got.
No, that was awesome. I mean, one of the many things I find exciting about this book is the way that you managed to really get in very deep into the ACDF archive and also contextualize it and make it speak to, I think you have 21 other archives and libraries listed there. I mean, it's really, really impressive, but not in a show-offy way. Like it really makes you move through different scales of analysis, which is, and I think this is one of the great strengths of the book, is that each chapter basically embodies a different kind of methodological approach, and yet there's a series, a kind of narrative, where you kind of circle around through the Medical Republic of Letters, and then moving to Padua, and then down to Ravenna, and you see all these different responses to what previously. Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Siri just intervened. Siri's joining in. Sorry. You start to see. She threw me off my cursor. So this shift of analysis from merely looking at the kind of the theory, the top-heavy rules, to really getting into the weeds of what happens on the ground, the praxis, and the variety of responses is astounding. I wish could you just talk us through, say, I don't know, the case of Cremonini or Rossi, and just give us some kind of teaser glimpses to boost book sales.
Teaser glimpses to boost book sales, absolutely. I guess so. One of the early case studies is looking at the University of Padua, which in this moment around 1596, the Clementine Index comes out, and there's an effort to try to, well, so you all know about censorship, like stuff you can't read. It goes on the index of prohibited books. But that doesn't necessarily mean things are immediately burned. And in fact, what I'm following in my story is the ways in which many people around Italy, physicians in particular, get very upset about the fact that all of these really important medical books are now prohibited, that they're no longer allowed to have these really essential, what they see as essential, useful medical knowledge. They're no longer allowed to just have them. They have to get permission to keep them. They have to go and do line by line expurgations, changing the way that the book looks, cutting pages out, burning certain pages. But the ideal is that they don't want to have to burn the whole thing, because, I mean, as many scholars have shown us, something like Leonhard Fuchs's book on the history of plants is really expensive. Konrad Gessner's book on animals, like, this is a big fancy book, and physicians are basically uninterested in gutting their libraries. So they come up with a whole system. This is happening in other fields as well, but they're coming up with a whole system in order to expurgate books to make them available. So this is censorship. It's in this like fuzzy gray area about making texts available as much as it is about making texts unavailable. So I was following how after 1596, how the Congregation of the Index is trying to organize professional groups of censors, or formalize congregations, and this is an important thing, formalize congregations of censors in locations around Italy who are going to be tasked with correcting certain kinds of books. And so medical books go to the University of Padua, right? This is the most famous medical university, arguably in Europe at the time. Bologna would have fought that characterization, but Bologna gets tasked with doing law books instead. So the University of Padua gets tasked with having to correct all of these medical books, and they bring in a team of experts who are the famous philosophers of the day, the famous physicians of the day, and a bunch of local clerics as well, local ecclesiastics who are working with the bishop and the inquisitor to try to make these lists of corrections. It's like a huge amount of work, right? Like, you're going through and doing sort of like a line by line reading, looking both on a superficial level for when people are citing the Bible that's not the Vulgate edition, superficial level saying Erasmus's name, black that out. But then also like a more serious level, like are the ideas problematic? Is the use of astrology usurping God's power? So they're asking for readership. Censorship is this kind of censorship. Expurgation is asking for readership at a very intense level for these censors. And so this group of censors assembles in Padua, and what I watch is how, like, basically it all falls apart. The inquisitor has meetings of the Inquisition on the days that they're supposed to meet, so they're not going to be able to do that. The professors are basically completely uninterested. They're like, but we're so busy with our teaching. There's no way we'll be able to censor books on the side. The inquisitor is concerned that he doesn't have any money to be able to buy books, which is probably, and the professors say the same thing. They aren't going to be able to get their hands on the books. Like, they can get their hands on the books. This is a period in Padua where, I mean, and this is sort of how I've tried to use peripheral or additional archives, like going through the Inquisition records in Venice. I was trying to read a little bit around the context of like what it looks like to be living in Padua in this time and how rare books are circulating, who's getting prosecuted for having rare books in this period. I came across this amazing example of a guy who actually becomes a physician, and he finds this prohibited manuscript that he then like takes home and copies, and then gets in trouble for having this copied manuscript because it's why do you have a copy of it? He's like, well, I had to copy it because it was all covered in mud. They're like, what? Where did you find it? He's like, oh, I found it in the place behind the university building where I go to pee. So like, right, like it's not that they can't find these books that they say they can't find. Like they are awash in prohibited books. They're everywhere. But these are acts of resistance left and right. And yet then we see somebody like Cesare Cremonini, who is probably like the person who is most prosecuted, actually, the person who is most prosecuted by the Inquisition at this point. The most famous professor at the philosophy professor at the University of Padua, hands down, famously prosecuted by the Inquisition. And at the end of the day, he's the only one who signed, the only non-ecclesiastic who's signing on to expurgations. Like all of those physicians have dropped out, and you end up with the prosecuted Cremonini signing on. He's like still participating. What is he doing? I think it becomes self-interested for him. I think that we're seeing him trying to cozy up to a system that is taking aim at his works left and right. That he's trying to engage with that system in a different way that he thinks will benefit him ultimately in the long run. So that's one version, the sort of Paduan subversion model. But then you might see a guy like Girolamo Rossi, who's the guy that I followed to Ravenna. And that presents a very different model. It presents a model of pious Catholic reading, or Girolamo Rossi is from like a very distinguished family or a very religious family. His uncle was head of the Carmelite order. Girolamo had followed him around as a sort of humanist scribe early on in his career. He'd been to Rome, he'd been to the Vatican Library doing that work. He wrote this, he's most famous for his book on the history of Ravenna, but he was a physician and he was working in Ravenna, which is like kind of a backwater at that time. It's like about 1,000 years past its prime. And yet he's, when the call goes out asking for physicians who will step up to take on what people call the honorable enterprise, the honorable enterprise of censorship, Girolamo Rossi steps up, and this is his own sort of little personal counter-reformation of medicine. Like he's going through and just like cranking out these expurgations. He's going through his Cardano, he's rereading all of these texts that he owns and trying to come up with ways of changing them, of correcting them, of censoring them such that they can then be used and be Catholic. And this becomes that's a very different model of participating in this system. I think one of the things that Nick was talking about, the different archives, and I think that the different archives are a really important part of what I've tried to do in this book, because they shed light on the many different ways that people participate in and work against systems of censorship. And one of the things that came out of my work in the archives and libraries in Ravenna about Girolamo Rossi in particular was that as I was going through his papers, I noticed at a certain point that he was like, these are his drafts. We have like his draft letters, we have his draft treatises, we've got his some of them are like clean copies that he kept, but the bulk of it is kind of messy. And he's got treatises where he's going through then and changing, right? Like editing his own work, but he's also censoring it. And so as I'm very interested in the ways that I think we need to think about censorship as a system, not only that is imposing what you can and can't read, but that really fundamentally changes the ways that people read in a lot of different ways. So I think that the process of expurgating, the idea that you would read with a pen in hand, as Tony Graft and Lisa Jardine have talked to us about, like for action, right? The action for Counter-Reformation scholars is expurgation. The reading with pen in hand isn't just to take notes into your commonplace book, but it's also to remove things and to think about the ways in which those two processes are connected. So those are some of the things that I've been trying to pull out through these studies that look at particular censors very closely.
So in that, one of the techniques that I was had imagined the censors would be employing would be just to kind of anonymize knowledge. Like if a Protestant says it, just remove the name and maybe reprint the book and just kind of in terms of the kind of the way that we think the long-term arc, like Foucault's argument about scientific knowledge becomes anonymous, whereas literary knowledge becomes onymous. And they kind of resist doing that. And yet, as you really beautifully show, the effacement of a name isn't meant to be a removal from discourse. It's still there under oh, yes, good. There we go. It's still legible, and you're still meant to be able to read the authority which underpins the statement while disapproving of its existence. That's a really peculiar dynamic that I really wasn't expecting. I also thought that there would be a lot of content censorship, and you have some beautiful examples, you know, pubic hair and references to abortion and some really nice content specific examples, but it seems like the bulk of the labor is about wrestling with Protestant authority and trying to make it safe, but I'm not sure safe is the right term.
Yeah, I think it's about ritually reinscribing Protestants, not as not there, but as damned, right? I think that's the issue. It's not that fundamentally so much of the content is going to be okay, right? These censors are reading the works of Leonhard Fuchs, who I've shown here, and the censors are like, there's nothing wrong with this. It's a book about plants. Like, it's just plants. Some editions don't even have really words. They're just pictures of plants. So then, like, what do you do with that? And this became very interesting to me because I'm very interested in the ways that names are coming up again and again. And this is like just an example that I thought was so fantastic because Leonhard Fuchs's face gets crossed out, right? So like the Damnatio Memoriae, it's like he's being defaced right now, in addition to having his name expurgated in interesting ways, right? Like the letters are changed into different things and then they're blacked out. But I want to point out also, I'm going to stop share and share a different image for a moment, that one of the things that I found over and over again were these reading licenses. And what's really important here is that we have to understand that if we're going to take seriously that censorship is not just about getting rid of text in this period, it's not just about getting rid of books, but it's about correcting them and making them available to people who will use them responsibly and safely. And by responsibly and safely, I mean like in a way that relates to their piety and their soul. If we're going to take that quite seriously, there has to be then a way of regulating that. And one of the things that I've uncovered that I think I feel most proud of in this book is I've gone through just thousands and thousands of requests for reading licenses. And I want to dwell on this for just, is that okay, Nick? Can I go there for a minute?
Yeah, that's
or 5.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a funny story because I'd anticipated, I mean, Ugo Baldini and Lane Spruitt's first collection of published volume or collection of published materials from this archive included about I like 100 or 120 reading licenses, and I was like, oh, these are so interesting. This is so cool. And I was engaging with some sort of digital humanities work, so I was like, what a cool idea for a database, right? Like to be able to find these. And so I kept looking for them, and they're scattered in a bunch of different places. But when I see that they're scattered, they're never what you see here, right? Which is an actual reading license. This is the license to read a prohibited book. That's never, ever what you see. What you see instead are requests for permission to read certain texts, or here, I've got another one. Sorry, one moment. Nope, I'm failing. All right. So what you see instead are requests are sort of the bureaucracy surrounding reading licenses. Those reading licenses are completely ephemeral. Like I found maybe about 6,000 reading licenses that I've got in a database. At this point, about 5 of them are like formal licenses on pieces of paper stamped. I've got a couple that are notarized copies of those also. So mostly these things haven't survived. We sometimes see them inscribed. For those of you who are booksellers, keep your eyes peeled for these. If there's a book that's on the index of prohibited books that was circulating in Italy, on flyleaves all the time, these things say like, I've seen the Inquisitor so-and-so has approved this. And so these are circulating all the time in ways that we haven't totally noticed. But I was in the archives and I was looking for them and talking to other scholars who were there. And they were tipping me off about places where they'd seen some and not others, because they're dispersed across a bunch of different archival series. They're being granted by lots of different authorities at different times. And I had this realization when I was in my first year of graduate school. I read Emmanuel Lavoie-Laduries' French Peasants of Languedoc, and I was like, this is awful. Like, this is, I mean, it's amazing research, but like, I can't even imagine what it would have been like to like sit there and like tally grain amounts for a million years. And then I realized at month like 4 of copying lists of books that I was in my own little world. I just thought this was like the best thing ever. I was finding thousands of these things. I was trying to, they have all sorts of data involved in them, right? Like they're granted to individuals for specific texts. They're very rarely sort of open-ended. You can read anything. It's like you can read the works by Leonhard Fuchs and those by Conrad Gessner, but not Machiavelli, but not Galileo. So they have all of this like amazing information in them. And I tried to, in this book, give a sense of the different ways that we can find readers, that we can find trends in readership. And I think that one of the things that maybe comes out of looking at these texts are the ways that censorship that is, well, a few things. One, getting back to the sort of like names, you can't forget who you're reading because you have to keep getting a reading license for it. So it's not like crossing Leonhard Fuchs's name off of your book. That's an important step to being able to keep it, but that's not the end. You then need to have a license in order to keep it. So you're never forgetting who these people are. It's about changing readership practices. It's about reminding yourself every time you open that book that you're reading a work that is written by a damned author, and that needs to like sort of change your reading place. And I think that I think that this becomes sort of a very serious way that we need to think about how people approached books in this period and what the act of expurgation was meant to do. So I've been looking at that, and then also about how like the certain texts that are then allowed, if we see like lots of requests for certain types of books, I think it becomes very interesting that we end up getting sort of a canon of prohibited knowledge. Texts that people throughout the 17th century, like Fuchs is not new in 1660, right? Like that book is 120 years old by then, and people are still reading it because it becomes this sort of like set of knowledge that people have to have, that they expect to be able to get. And I think that that's happening sort of, that gets sort of like reified through the licensing system largely.
So this category of, I mean, your title, forbidden knowledge, this oxymoron, basically, but which reveals itself to be a kind of socio-epistemological category, right? It's forbidden to certain people, known by certain people. That's the kind of category that you open up so beautifully here, and the dynamics of which become visible through this really meticulous archival work. I don't have a question to follow that. I just wanted to say that really kind of got me thinking. But let's carry on with that. This kind of larger argument that you make about the kind of categories of reading being codified, or at least coming into some form of communal practice in this period, because you, one of the places you want to take this argument is to outside of medicine at the end. In your epilogue, you use this to reframe and reapproach, and I think completely change the position in which we think of Galileo's Dialogo. And to come up with an original reading of the Dialogo in 2020 is
will earn me a lot of hate.
I don't think so. I think I found that really stimulating and convincing. Could you just run through that argument for those of us who haven't yet read the epilogue plot,
Yeah.
plot spoiler?
Yeah, we'll go ahead and spoil. So, and this is going to get me to sort of like a personal archive moment too, because as I was in the archives, going through the papers of the Roman Inquisition, I came across the like the set of um, archival documents surrounding the condemnation of Copernicanism, the expurgations that were made necessary, like in order to keep Copernicus. And I just had this moment where I was like, this is huge. Like, this is, I'm getting to touch this material. It's like when you come across a Galileo letter in the, like, in the unrelated file in Venice, right? Like, it was just so exciting to see this in the context of all of these other things that I was looking at. And I was like, I know that this is published, but I'm just going to take like an hour and type it all out and spend a little bit of time just like being with it as an archival document in relation to all of these other materials that I was studying, because it's just one case among so many, right? It's become the case. It's become the story about how censorship works. Like the church bans Copernicus, Galileo keeps doing it, and then they get really mad at Galileo and it's over. And yet I've been looking at like how this is happening differently for so many other books. And that in fact, the church bans Copernicus, but they expurgate him right at first, right? He lives in this like limbo realm. All we're not burning Copernicus. It's getting expurgated. And this became very interesting to me about like, what does the story about medicine say? Does it speak to the broader, does it speak to the story that has become iconic about censorship? If we look at the non-iconic field, right? If we look at medicine instead of astronomy, do we get a different appreciation of what was going on in astronomy? And I think so. And part of the argument that I'm trying to make there about Galileo's dialogue is that Galileo's dialogue actually starts as a long letter. It's not a letter. It's, as Nick has told us many times, it's not like just a letter. It's like a big published manuscript treatise attacking this guy named Ingoli, who's the ecclesiastic who censors, lawyer and ecclesiastic who censors Copernicus. And Galileo he just hates it. He's like, how can you be doing this? You are so unqualified. In like perfect Galileo form, he just goes right ad hominem, right? It's just like, it only sometimes relates to the content. It's like often just really hating Ingoli. And I was like, what's going on here? And so again, I'm just trying to contextualize what Galileo is up to in this relationship. And I started thinking like Galileo is like in Padua around the time that folks are sorting out whether or not they're going to work with the censors in Padua or not. This is the world that he's learning, that he's coming into his own as a really famous scholar in, and he's quite resistant to it. And so I think that as I started to think about the dialogue as not just like this beautiful culmination of his theory, but as a polemical response to censors, I went back and did a sort of a rereading of some of the prefatory material and what became the final dialogue, where he's talking about expertise. And when he's talking about expertise in exactly the same way that these censors at the University of, or that the Catholic Church and lay physicians are talking about expertise. Who has the expertise to really know what's going on in the content of work, like of a scientific work? Does that expertise lie at the level of the physician, of the astronomer, the mathematician, or is an ecclesiastic able to have that expertise? And I think that that's what Galileo is weighing in on. And he's doing so from a position of Paduan resistance, not from a position of Girolamo Rossi pious learning. So I think that that became really obvious to me. And then it also became very interesting to me that Galileo, again, in these opening pages in the preliminary materials to the final dialogue, is presenting his work as fundamentally useful. And this is something that's come up again and again over the course of my book, is thinking about what utility means. Because I think that we've taken utility, I think that in much of Europe, we have taken a concept of scientific utility that comes out of Bacon and England, and that is a technological applied utility, that is a utility that becomes very important in France in the 18th century, right? Like these are, they exist, but I've been tracing throughout this book how over and over again in response to what the relationship should be between physicians' expertise and that of ecclesiastics, physicians are repeatedly talking about the utility of the knowledge that they need and the utility of the medical profession for maintaining a healthy society. And so and it's always utility. And I was like, what's going on here? And I think that what we're seeing is a way in which this notion of scientific utility is being hashed out in relation to prohibitions. So I think it's yet another example of when we see it in Galileo, that this is not just like, oh, it's so useful, Grand Duke, right? But like, useful is a weighty word. Useful is trying to say something. Galileo's using utility, an argument about utility, to talk about the ways in which knowledge in the hands of certain practitioners is essential and can't be circumscribed by a system like Catholic censorship. So I think we've missed that with Galileo, maybe up until now. And I think that sort of positioning him as an epilogue in this book, as an epilogue to medicine, right? Like, who's going to put Galileo as an epilogue to medicine, right? Like, Galileo is the centerpiece and medicine is a footnote. So I think that, like, sort of reorienting our focus a little bit sheds really important light on what Galileo was doing and about the context that he was working in.
That was awesome. We have maybe a time for one more. Maybe so in terms of the kind of time frame of the book, you start off with this gorgeously kind of aggressive and violent medical republic of letters in the decades before the index crystallizes. My favorite quote has to be somebody scribbling in the margin, "Mattioli, you're still an asshole." Love that. I'm going to write that in, not in this, but in all kinds of books. And so you have this kind of uncivil beginning, so this fantasy that we still entertain of the erudite, smoothly functioning, perpetual motion machine of the Republic of Letters actually being polemical, mean-spirited. And then you move, the book isn't entirely organized chronologically, but there is a kind of chronological shift there as you move through different spaces and scales. Right at the beginning, though, you open with this wonderful letter from Redi to Leopoldo de Medici, where he confesses his inability to resist temptation. It's kind of Wildian move. I guess I have a question about the process of expurgation and whether there's a kind of whether it is itself seen as a kind of purgative healing move that is always going to be required and is also somehow kind of generating the desires that Red is experiencing, that he wants to be tempted and he wants to not be able to resist temptation, but he also wants to take his medicine. But he wants his medicine to be tasty. He wants a spoonful of sugar with it as well. What's going on there? And I guess the bigger question is also, what's the kind of, if we were to look a century after that letter, where do you see the arc going? I mean, is it that the dynamics under analysis here have created the tools of things like utility, which then become the standard norms of scientific discourse? Because that's a pretty strong claim. Censorship creates science. Is that the end point?
I think that censorship creates a certain valence in how people are talking about utility in 17th century, 16th and 17th century Italy. I think it would be really interesting to go out and look at what that word means in different contexts. I've had some really interesting conversations with colleagues about, like, what is Descartes doing when he's talking about utility? Like, I think that we maybe shouldn't take that necessarily as being about technology anymore. I think that should maybe be looked at more closely. And so I think that one of the things that this book has tried to do is that, I mean, like, this is one of these paradoxes that the things I describe as the paradox of censorship, is that, like, because of censorship, people had to make explicit what they meant when they wanted to keep a text, right? They had to make explicit why it was that they wanted to keep it. They had to make explicit which texts they wanted, and they had to justify them. And I think we can learn a lot about what people understood to be knowledge at that moment. What was important knowledge, what was useful knowledge, what was pious knowledge, and how these things could potentially intersect. I don't think that I want you to take that strong version of the argument to mean necessarily that censorship makes science, but I also don't think that it burns science either. And we've seen that, like, just so clearly in many forms. And I think that I think that we might want to look again at utility in other contexts and the way that it's being leveraged. And I mean, like, Bacon is so interesting too. I mean, like, Bacon, I think I'm on a Bacon path with some other things, but I think, like, Bacon is reading tons and tons of Italians in really important ways. And so, like, maybe he's doing something completely different with that, but I wonder about some of the material that he's taking in. So I just think that we have to understand the context that lead to an important sort of discursive term that's become very weighty in science, and understand that that's going to shift over time. And it's not like nobody talks about the utility of medicine before censorship either. And that's one of the things that I want to be really clear about. It's not like people only talk about the utility of medicine. People are talking about the utility of law at the same time as well. And I think that these are, like, related issues also about stabilizing ideas about knowledge and authority and how those relate to censorship. So I think that I hope that this can be sort of a springboard for other kinds of projects that look into how people are justifying and explaining through a system of censorship.
I see we're starting to see some questions pop up in the chat, so I thought we might take a look at some of those. Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Nick. It's really fascinating to think about utility almost as a kind of concept that includes an idea of social good to it as well in response to prohibition. So one of our first questions is from Peter Stallybrass, who thanks you for a terrific, fabulous, and transformative book. Yes. And he's wondering if you could say a bit more about your emphasis on expurgation as opposed to prohibition, and how you think expurgation may have demanded specific kinds of attention from readers.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Well, the reason that I became interested in expurgation is because when I was an undergrad at the University of Pennsylvania taking Peter Stallybrass and Rosa Chartier's class, I saw expurgated books. And it became so clear to me that, I mean, that censorship wasn't a black and white issue where things have to go away or are okay, that things are moving in and out of those categories, and that there's this really interesting fuzzy gray area that creates just a lot of discourse, a lot of conversation, and it reveals a lot about what people are valuing. This is getting to the utility part. But so it became clear to me that there's so much work on censorship in Italy. Like, I do not claim to be the 40th person writing about the history of censorship in Italy. Like, there's a lot of scholarship here. And some of that scholarship is, like, really provocative and important about how, for example, thinking about Giulio Lafranito's work on the Bible, how prohibiting the vernacular Bible creates, like, classes of people who are able to engage with religion in very different ways. This is a really important and robust literature. But what became really interesting to me was how science and how medical practitioners, how physicians were interacting with the gray area in particular, and how they sort of fell into a gray area right away, right? Like, there are areas that are not gray areas, like religion. You can't read Luther. You're not going to get, like, your local bishop to write into the Inquisition endorsing your desire to read Luther. I mean, like, very rare cases, but they're so unusual that they don't even, like, make it into the bureaucratic like archival series that I'm talking about. And yet there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are reading other kinds of prohibited books, that, like, the story of prohibition isn't just about religion. It starts with religion, and it starts with religion in these like really broad strokes that don't work for other fields, right? Because the physicians that I'm talking about who are censored when I'm talking about a history of like prohibited medical knowledge, like these guys are prohibited because they're Protestants. That's why so many of them are prohibited in the first place. And then it becomes a story about trying to figure out what to make of the content afterwards. So it was sort of my interest in expurgation came from sort of a need to push back against this idea that prohibitions were absolute. Nobody thought they were absolute at the time. There are always ways around them, right? I mean, like Galileo doesn't have a license to read Copernicus, and we know Galileo was reading Copernicus. So you can always just illegally read something. And we might think about what the stakes of that are too. There are different stakes for different kinds of reading. You're not going to get burned at the stake for reading Leonhard Fuchs, Conrad Gessner, Girolamo Cardano. That's not, they might take the books away from you and you might get in trouble, but you're not going to be killed for doing that. You might be tried and convicted of heresy for reading and distributing books by John Calvin. And so there are different sort of elements at stake there. But I was sort of frustrated by the notion that sort of absoluteness, which is even then a little porous, but the much more absoluteness about religion was getting sort of grafted onto our sort of more general understanding of censorship of a much wider variety of materials. And I mean, in some ways we're following, if you look at the prohibited, like index of prohibited books, that tells one story, but you've got to look at all of these other things. And so I guess, Peter, well, I think one of the things that you want to get me at is the idea that like these books are telling a story. And I don't even think we talked about this particularly, or we only touched on this, but I looked at just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of copies of expurgated books as part of my research for this. And this is, I think, something that's been really hugely shaped by my experience in your class, my experience in a number of classes at the Rare Books School and my training there, is thinking about the ways that these books themselves can become an archive for understanding a subject like censorship. That if you look at enough copies, you can start to see where there are outliers, what's sort of a normal relationship to a prohibited book, like maybe just like crossing off the name, what becomes a sort of devious way of expurgating your book, like a very thin line through something that it's like, just just like so clearly that it's entirely ritualistic, which I don't think we should undermine the fact that you're ritually engaging with a book this way. But that's very different from like a cut and paste project where you've like very carefully pasted a little slip over the author's name on every folio of a 300 folio book. Like there's lots of ways, lots of practices involved in censorship. And I think that those became very apparent to me as I was looking through just all of these different copies. And then it became really obvious. Okay, so the book was originally supposed to start, when it was a dissertation, was supposed to stop with a chapter on censored objects. So the book was the last chapter, or the censorship of books, the physical censorship, expurgation of books was the last chapter. But then I was in these libraries, like trying to find censored books, which aren't usually cataloged as being expurgated. Like that's not how you find them. I was very helpful when I learned how to read a collocation formula, because knowing that like preliminary materials are missing, like that's often in a collocation formula in an Italian library. And if it's a prohibited book and A2 through 3 is missing, it's probably missing the dedicatory letter to a Protestant prince, right? Like these are some of the things that I learned to recognize, but I also started to learn to recognize and trace how those collections and libraries came to be, because a book that enters a library in the 19th century from wherever, the chances of that being censored are slim, especially since many of these books that are expurgated are books that are printed in Protestant Northern Europe, and then they're brought into Italy. So they have to have been books that were in Italy in the 16th and 17th centuries. And so then I was tracing like how these collections came to be, how you get a collection of medical books at a place like the University of Padua. Like who's donating those books? How does the collection come to the Marciana? How does the Vatican Libraries collection of medical books become so robust? Why are some of them censored and others aren't? So it became a story about libraries and collecting also in a way that I felt really excited about and that I hadn't anticipated when I first started the project. I'm just going to show one image really quickly so you can get a laugh, which I won't be able to hear, but that's okay. I'm getting used to making jokes into Zoom space for myself. This is the Corsiniana, which is an 18th century Italian library, late 17th, early 18th century. And you can see the shelves of heterodox books, right? So like the fact that you would, and this gets to Nick's last question a little bit too, the fact that books are prohibited doesn't mean that they're needing to disappear. And in fact, this is being so explicitly announced in what becomes a papal library, right? That it's actually built into the structure of the library in lots of different ways. And then when I'll just share a very brief story. When I wrote to the archive asking for permission to publish this, they were like, that's a terrible image. Can we give you a better one? And I was like, no, because I really liked the fire extinguisher. And it just seemed like a good moment that I wanted to keep.
Thanks so much for that fascinating answer, Hannah. Next question comes from Jim Stokes, who thanks you both, Nick and Hannah, for a fascinating discussion. So it's always seemed to him that censorship exists to protect the status quo of the wealthy and powerful. During your research, Hannah, did you also find any striking examples of censorship's sibling, overt propaganda?
Overt propaganda. I think that that's something that you see a little bit more in the realms, in like the political realm or the religious realm, and a little bit less in the realm that I was looking at. The other thing that I want to recognize is that I'm looking at a very sort of specific aspect of censorship, which is that books are censored in lots of different ways, right? And at lots of different stages in their production. And I'm looking at books that are already published, right? So books that are largely written, printed, and published in the first half of the 16th century. So they already exist. They're already out there. They're already expensive. They're already bound. They're beautiful. And many of them are already in Italy too. Not all, but many are already in Italy. And how then people are justifying and working with keeping them. And yes, there's some like, I don't know, there's just some enthusiasm about these. Like I've got all these people who are like talking about like, they're having like a fantasy, which isn't quite like the same way that we think of fantasy, but there is like this sort of like delighted element, bibliophilia, that is absolutely present for physicians. They love books. Their book collections are really important to who they are. If we think about physicians as part of a status quo, maybe, or like maintaining their own professional position, I think that that's another maybe important thing to think about. And I've got an image that I'd love to show you really quickly, which is, this is Girolamo and Stefano Colli, who are, I actually follow a bunch of their reading license requests over the course of the 1520s to 40s, or 1620s to 40s, I think. But this is a biblioportrait, right? These are physicians, or a physician and his young son, a physician in his library, right? This is like how they are self-presenting. So I think that like we've got to think about these books as like status symbols. And when we think about what the polemics are involved, the part of the polemics is like a professional discourse on the part of physicians about their own importance and self-importance. And it's important to recognize that as well.
We've got some more questions popping into the chat there. I can only wish for pediments like that in my own library, right? Holding up bookshelves there. We got a question from Laylee Mahoney, who asks about censored books that we maybe only know about because they were censored, right? Books that show up on church records and on the indexes, but are otherwise missing. Did you come across any examples like that in your research?
Yeah, I mean, there are books that are, I mean, it's more it's tough. A lot of these books that I'm studying are like big fancy books. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And so as we, like one of the things that we know about big books is that big books survive, right? And there's a lot of like ephemeral material that doesn't. And I think like is part of the reason that there's only sort of one copy of Fuchs's diagram of the ear printed as a giant broadsheet. Like that might have something to do with censorship. It might not. It might just be that it's an ephemeral publication. But I think that you're absolutely right to be attentive to that like format matters, that things are erased, things do disappear. But things also don't disappear. And this is a story about medicine and the ways that like lots of things are prohibited and yet don't disappear, and the many reasons why not.
Next question comes from Natale. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. She thanks you for your truly superb work. And her question has to do with expurgation. During your research, did you verify which indices expurgatory were used in the different regions of the Italian peninsula? Did the censors use only the 1607 Roman index or also foreign tools like the many Spanish or Portuguese expurgatory?
Yeah, they're definitely using Spanish expurgations before the Roman one exists. So like they're like, well, if I mean, and not even in like Spanish Southern Italy, like in Bologna, people, Aldrovandi's like looking at the Spanish index to understand what he's supposed to do with some of his books. So yes, these are absolutely reference tools that are moving across these spaces. One of the things that I thought was really interesting that I never followed up on, but when I was working in Lecce, was that there are all of these books that are undersigned by, not by inquisitors, but by like monks who were moving around from one library, like checking one library. And this is something I haven't followed up on. So there's much more to do. There's just so much out there, right? I mean, like this is one of the things that has been so amazing to me. But yeah, I think that one of the things that my book tries to raise is that, and maybe this relates a little bit to the last question, which isn't, it's not that the 1607 expurgatory index doesn't exist. It's not that it disappears, right? There are lots of copies of it, but it is like largely absent from the scholarship. People think it has no impact, and that it's totally unimportant. And I think that that's just so false. It's so false for a number of reasons, but one of them is that if you have a reading license, the terms of a lot of these reading licenses include like the admonition that you have to correct it according to the 1607 index expurgatoria. So I think that like there's a huge vacuum, there's a huge void until the 1607 Roman index comes along. And even then it doesn't fill anything near like what's being produced in Spain, in Portugal. But one of the things that I've tried to be really attentive to is that these different expurgatory indices have local context that they're responding to. And what's prohibited in Spain isn't necessarily exactly what's prohibited in Rome. And the ways that people are attentive to this are really interesting and really different. And I mean, Natalia, I know you've read this already, so I'm like, Bob, like it's a little bit boring for you. But one of the things that's been really interesting is thinking about like Arnaldo Villanova or Ramon Lull. And so how these Spanish scholars, how Rome is managing the prohibitions on Spanish scholars, because they don't, the expurgations of their works, they're going and soliciting advice from Spanish theologians about how to deal with them. Because the other thing to realize is that like this is highly political as well, right? Like none of these things, religion, science, these don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in highly politicized spaces. And so I've tried to bring out some of those political tensions that are involved in reading and interpretation as well. So thank you.
Yeah, fantastic question. So I think we're coming up on 3 o'clock. So we have time for one more question today. From Andrea Otone. And Andrea, thanks to you for all the work that you've put into this fantastic book. And they are wondering if you could say a bit about individuals who maybe were opportunists, who were medical practitioners, who were interested in participating and being part of the machinery of book expurgation so that they could get away with some good forbidden reading.
Yeah. So there are absolutely some cases of that, because in order to, before there is a robust licensing system that is like very clear for how you get a pathway over the course of like, especially the 1570s and 1580s, one of the ways to get a prohibited book is to agree to censor it. And honestly, and Andrea, I'm sure you saw this, but like, I don't mostly go there because I think that those are some really wonderful case studies that Italian scholars have got at quite well already, the ways that people are sort of using that part of the system. I hope that I'm showing that Cremonini is using the system in a way that we didn't understand, in a way that's maybe a little bit radical. But yes, I mean, some of these physicians are, I think that many of them are doing what they need to do in order to keep their libraries. Like it's about prioritizing their libraries. And that becomes patrimony as well. So it's about trying to figure out, if you look at the Colli, Girolamo and Stefano Colli, Girolamo is applying on his own at first, and then he's applying with his son later. And that's because you can't pass on a reading license. So you need to like establish this person as somebody who's going to be trustworthy enough to be able to apply on his own later and keep the books. I didn't actually find any from Stefano, license requests from Stefano on his own, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. I think people are absolutely like aware of these many different routes and valences. And I mean, I hope we find more ways that people are engaging creatively with the system. And I think that if we read Galileo's dialogue a little bit differently, we might see it as part of a creative engagement with a system of censorship also.
Yeah. I love that idea of passing down the family business and reading forbidden books. All right, well, I want to say a big thank you to Hannah and to Nick for sharing information and knowledge from Hannah's new book, Forbidden Knowledge. Thank you to you both for the great conversation today, and thank you to all who attended and who participated in the Q&A. As we're getting ready to go, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. Laura and Donna C have popped these up into the chat for you. One, this was a presentation sponsored by the Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography. I hope that you'll check us out and check out our website, especially if you are a graduate student or an early career scholar, and you found this to be work that you were interested in and excited about. We hope that you'll think about joining us in the Society of Fellows, and also take a look at RBS's programs. They have scholarships available for courses next summer, and I think applications will also be opening up relatively soon for RBS applications as well. And thank you finally to Laura Idem and to Neil Curtis as well for organizing everything for us as well. Thank you both. This was really fantastic and fabulous.
Thank you all.